Let me first of all say it's a great pleasure for me to welcome you to this Brandt lecture 22. As you know, Brandt lectures are some kind of a special thing for us because they go beyond headlines. We try and leave day-to-day business. We try and connect the dots. And what we'll try and do also today is we'll try and essentially, take a 10,000 view perspective and ask, what is that we're seeing once the fog of day-to-day politics is lifted? And what is it that emerges as broader dynamics, as something that goes beyond trying to solve immediate problems? And I guess this is precisely what is also in line with what our namesake, Willy Brandt, thought about when heading the North-South Commission. This was about big picture, and yes, it is also about big questions. And one of the big questions that we're going to ask today, or the big question that we're going to ask today, is what about multilateralism? It is a big question, but it's a question that was driven home by a couple of events, notably Afghanistan and the foreign-led interventions there, what happened to them and how they ended. But also when it comes to Ukraine, two very different settings, two very different contexts, two very different types of actors involved. But still, those two different conflicts tell us something about the bigger picture we're looking at here. And before I forget, I should also introduce myself maybe, and that's, my name is Andreas Golter. I'm the director of the wonderful Brandt School that we pride ourselves to be our workplace. It's a great pleasure to see all of you here, a diverse bunch of students and other guests. Thanks very much for coming here, and a very warm welcome to Dr. Wieland-Karimi from the Center of Peace Operations. I looked you up before you came here, and in fact, what the website says, in fact, is you have 192 experts on mission at the moment in 60 missions and operations comprising 37 countries. I'm pretty sure we'll touch upon one or two of the country level experiences that you can bring to this conversation, but it's a globally active organization when it comes to peace and conflict. And Dr. Wieland-Karimi brings to this conversation a very personal background. She has a master's in Oriental Studies from Bonn University and also a PhD in that area. But there's also a strong degree of international experience in her long-standing career, among other, for the Friedrich Ebert Foundation, which she headed, whose office she headed in Washington, D.C., until 2009, and before that, she in fact set up their office in Kabul in Afghanistan, and brings a great wealth of local expertise and regional expertise to this conversation. She has a very long CV. Let me just mention two additional things. She's on the board of the Stiftung Mercator, which is one of Germany's prime foundations, and of the Bundeswehr Command and Staff College, a reputed organization. We're greatly honored to have you here. Thanks very much for giving our Brandt Lecture 22, and the floor is all yours. We're looking forward.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. It's great to be here. First of all, I have to admit, I always wanted to come here because I personally knew Dietmar Herz. I very much liked him. He was a very knowledgeable person. He came to Washington, D.C. a couple of times. And I always enjoyed conversations with him, and we've had him on panels at the time for the Ebert Foundation. So it's really a privilege to be here. We also know each other from Washington. At least we briefly met a couple of years ago. When you always talk about my vast experience, it makes me a little bit uncomfortable because it tells me how old I have grown into this. But I have to say, I'm still very passionate about international relations. And I love to talk to students of international relations because it really widens also my ideas on what we do on a day-to-day level. And the job I have right now as the executive director of the Center for International Peace Operations is really a management job. It's political management. I will tell you a little bit more about the institution later, and maybe for one or the other of you, there might be job opportunities in the future as well that might become interesting one day. Well, but first of all, to earn my dinner that I hopefully will get later on, I was given quite a topic after Afghanistan and Ukraine. What about multilateralism? First of all, it's a difficult word to pronounce. But secondly, it also gave me and my colleague Karina and others at ZIF the opportunity to have a wider lens on what we do and what happens to our field of international cooperation. So it actually helped us a lot as well to kind of focus again in our daily management job on what we do, with whom we cooperate, why we do that. So I have to say it's quite an interesting topic, and it feels like a home run because actually ZIF colors are orange. It's not yours. It might be also the Conservative Party in Germany or the Dutch, whoever, but we exactly have the same color. And I will be given this cup after the lecture, but since there's no glass, I have it now. So I really feel at home now. Well, as you all know, we live in politically interesting and challenging times. In times of tectonic power political changes and shifts. This direction goes into a multipolar world dominated by the US and by China. Europe is becoming less important and less powerful, and other regions of the world gain more economic and political leverage. And challenges know no borders. In times of globalization, all states are connected to each other. Conflicts that take place thousands of kilometers away have consequences for the life of people in other regions of the world. For example, conflicts on the African continent have consequences for us living here in Germany. And phenomena like climate change or the pandemic, but also food insecurity and supply chains show this clearly. We're witnessing these tunes and we are living in them. Therefore, it is of crucial importance to observe and analyze these developments and try to shape and form them, to balance interest of all, or at least of many actors in this international world. And let me say it's really an honor and a pleasure to speak to you today, and I'm especially looking forward to your questions and comments. The more challenging, the better. I will focus in my lecture today on three things. First of all, I will focus on, or trying to give a definition of what multilateralism is. I will focus on the latest developments in Ukraine and Afghanistan. That is my second part of the lecture. And third, I will talk about the erosion of the international order and of multilateral cooperation as a trend over the last decades. To my understanding, the erosion of the international order is rather a trend than a turning point after Afghanistan and Ukraine. Well, to the multilateral definition, what that really is. On the negative side, these tectonic shifts, these tectonic power political shifts, entail insecurity, a rise in conflicts worldwide, and it also entails a growing number of challenges that have consequences for nearly all 8 billion people on this planet, like climate change, food security, pandemics. So, I have to quote Willy Brandt coming to Erfurt and coming to the Willy Brandt school. So he said in his lecture when he received the Nobel Prize in December 1971, he said, I quote, "Under the threat of mankind's self-destruction, coexistence has become a question of the very existence of man. Coexistence became not one of several acceptable possibilities, but the only chance of survival. So Willy Brandt saw multilateral cooperation as the main pillar to secure peace. His idea was, as long as states cooperate, as long as states talk to each other, there is a lesser probability of them being in conflict, in war, in confrontation. And he was in favor of a, I quote, Weltinnenpolitik, meaning a world domestic policy. That was his vision, or one of his visions. The multilateral order that existed for more than 70 years, starting with the end of the Second World War and the founding of the United Nations in 1945, now shows obvious cracks. The United Nations Security Council cannot agree on major crises and conflicts. For example, on the war in Ukraine. And I should also mention that the Sustainable Development Goals will not be reached in due time. Maybe we can say that the times between 1990 and 2020, 30 years, were kind of the golden ages or the golden years of multilateralism, a sunny area which is now over, at least from a Western perspective. After the fall of the wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union, a relatively calm, stable, peaceful times followed for Europe. What is multilateralism? I will paraphrase a little bit the definition of a concept paper or a white paper by the German government that was published last year, 2021, by the former government on multilateralism. It says, for all of you who studied Latin, I'm not sure whether you have to do that in Erfurt, but it means multi like multus, like many, and latus like side. So it basically means many sides. And the idea is that multi means many, as opposed to a bilateral cooperation, I'm meaning two, or unilateral action by only one country. What it also encompasses from this perspective, from a German foreign policy perspective, or I would say from a European one, is the cooperation between countries and also non-state actors, for example, like Greenpeace, Human Rights Watch, women's organizations, and others. And it implies a value-based understanding of multilateralism. It links international diplomacy by many actors with action in the framework of international organizations, which is aligned with those principles, norms, and sets of rules that underlie them. The more closely aligned all the relevant parties are in terms of these fundamental principles in their own interest, the more dependable and successful multilateralism is, obviously. With the Charter of the United Nations, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and the rules of international humanitarian law, the international community has agreed on a set of these common values and norms and rules. Therefore, there is a cornerstone for multilateral cooperation. Multilateralism also means that states should not follow their interest without regard and consideration of interest of other states or actors. This is based on the knowledge that at the end, all states profit the most when they cooperate and follow the same rules. This cooperation, a rules-based order, builds on the idea or takes for granted that all principles and values are shared by all. So much to the theory. Unfortunately, that is no longer the case, or it has never been the case. You might have heard about the Alliance for Multilateralism. It was an initiative by the former government. It was initiated by the former foreign ministers of Germany and France. It was also supported by many foreign ministers all over the planet. And their exact idea was that in times when key principles of the rules-based international order and essential instruments of international corporations are challenged, we need to find new forms and platforms to cooperate. Unfortunately, I have to say that not much has been heard of this alliance recently. Therefore, Willy Brandt's ideas and ideals, as well as the concept of multilateralism as the West sees it, proved wrong, or it proved false in the eyes of many states. Now, let's see why that happened. And now I come to the second part. What has happened in Afghanistan and in Ukraine? As you all know, the Afghanistan intervention started with 9/11, the attacks by Al-Qaeda on sites in the United States, on New York and on Washington, D.C. When that happened, NATO activated Article 5, saying that all NATO partners should come to the US defense. And they all came. And there was also a United Nations Security Council approval for that intervention that followed then. 20 years later, after many strategic shifts made by mainly the United States and followed by its partners, nearly 50 states involved, an Afghan government that has not lived up to the expectations, and a classical state-building dilemma, the humanitarian intervention ended in disaster. You might all recall these pictures of young Afghans holding on to aircrafts leaving the airport while many Afghans were evacuated from Kabul after, in the days following the 15th of August last year. And many partners of this international intervention, especially women and activists for democracy and human rights, got really scared. They didn't know what was going to happen, and they got scared by the new de facto regime of the Taliban. This was an international intervention, but it was basically a US intervention with international support. And it ended the same way, with the so-called Doha deal. It was initiated under the famous US president, Trump, who loved deals. So he also closed a deal on Afghanistan. And it only involved the Taliban and the US. It did not involve the Afghan government, NATO, or Afghan civil society, or other neighboring parties, but it was also only a deal between two conflict parties, meaning in no way it could be a sustainable deal. But that is what happened. It was for sure not a multilateral approach. And in contrary, it really alienated the Afghan government, civil society, NATO partners. The UN was marginalized. So there was a lot of frustrations, and the Taliban are now in power. Now, only a few months have passed after the West withdrew from Afghanistan, essentially leaving the country unconditionally under the de facto rule of Taliban control with devastating consequences. Some of you might have followed. There is an internal humanitarian, political, economic crisis in the country, and about 25% of the people, about 9 million out of 35 people, are facing famine, which is devastating news, and which is unfortunately also accelerated that development by the war in Ukraine because of the shortage of wheat and barley being imported to Afghanistan. Let's also talk briefly about Ukraine. Actually, the Ukraine crisis started much earlier. You might recall 2014, the Russian Federation, they occupied, or they annexed the Crimea, and they occupied the Donbas region. And after that, 2 international peace operations were implemented there, one by the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE, was a monitoring mission to monitor the Minsk agreement and the ceasefire agreement in that area, which was broken about 1,000 times a day. And in this mission, we had about 40 of our colleagues, civilian experts. I will talk about that a little later. There was a second mission by the European Union, and this was to help Ukraine to build its rule of law, to support the police, and to build functioning democratic institutions. With the growing nationalism in the Russian Federation, a reorientation to Tsarist Russia by the Russian leadership, and the Russian attack on Ukraine after February 24th, the security order in Europe has basically collapsed. Nearly 4 months into this war, with thousands of people killed, millions of refugees, there's no end in sight, because the situation is not ripe, as we call it in mediators' jargon. Ripe meaning that both sides still believe they can gain more militarily, and they are not ready to sit at the negotiating table. Rather, that looks like what we call colloquially a frozen conflict, officially, as a political scientist, a protracted conflict. I think the future will be a really long conflict, hopefully with less victims, but it will take years. And the question is whether Russia might attack another country, we don't know, in the future. The expectation that the war in Ukraine must be as pressing to states around the world as it is to Western states like Europe and the US is wrong. The first two resolutions by the UN General Assembly, which were supported by 141 and 140 member states, condemning the Russian aggression in Ukraine, should not obscure the fact that the Global South has a nuanced view of events. For example, in April this year, there were 93 countries that suspended the Russian Federation from the UN Human Rights Council. But there was a significant number, 24 including China, who voted against this or opted to abstain, 58 member states. That's quite a number, impressive number. It's interesting to look at the groups that work together. Let us first look at BRICS. I'm sure you all know BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. These 5 countries represent over 40% of the world's population, and together have a higher GDP than the 27 EU countries together. With the exception of Brazil, they have not joined in condemning Russia's attack in Ukraine. The BRICS Foreign Ministers meeting, chaired by China and hosted online in the mid of May, included the participation of the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, and Russia will most likely continue to be represented at their usual meetings in the future. India, in particular, is trying to maintain a careful balance between trade relations with China, relations with the United States, and arms exports from Russia. There's another big group that is the group of non-aligned states. They comprise 120 out of 193 member states. The war of aggression in Ukraine has broken a taboo and leading many non-aligned states to fear that this has opened the door to invasion in their own countries. And of course, they wonder what would happen then. At the same time, it includes many countries that have close ties, especially with China, and they are closely intertwined in terms of economic and security policies. And you all know the One Belt, One Road initiative started by China in 2003, and the big investments, especially on the African continent. And there's another perspective that more than 30 countries worldwide have signed military contracts with Russia. You might know the famous Wagner Group, a security company that is closely aligned with the Russian government. And they support many authoritarian regimes, for example, in Libya, in Mali, in Central African Republic, with private contractors, the Wagner Group. And they're competing in many places with international peace operations, which is really a difficult development, to put it mildly. Most BRICS states and non-aligned states in the global south see NATO as the crucial aggressor in the conflict. They say it was NATO who started the conflict and it was Russia which reacted. So we have to take into consideration that there are different perspectives to that. And also Afghanistan is mainly perceived as a failure by the US. These developments and opposed views, I have to say, form another step in the shift to a multipolar world. My third part on the erosion of the international order. We have to find out what is Russia's and China's view on multilateralism. And according to official publications and statements, the West represents an old multilateralism based on Western hegemony. According to this understanding, the post-World War II order was established by a very small group of mainly Western powers, and it reflected primarily their interest and aspirations. Well before the events in Afghanistan and Ukraine, China has already accelerated its diplomatic activism at the United Nations in various ways. For example, 2015, Xi Jinping gave a much-noticed speech at the UN talking about cooperation of partners, I quote, win-win cooperation and a community of shared futures of mankind. China wants to lead the reform of global governance based on a concept of fairness and justice. Russians and Chinese have taken over many leadership roles at international organizations. For example, at the United Nations, at the World Bank. And these were positions that were in the past traditionally claimed by Western countries. This has definitely changed. Out of 15 UN daughter organizations, 4 are headed by Chinese diplomats. Chinese also have co-founded many groups of friends at the United Nations. For example, like the group of Friends in Defense of the Charter of the United Nations in March 2021. All these groups include Russia, of course, deemed by China as a critical partner in restructuring global governance in a post-Western direction. There's also the perception by Russia, China, and others that the West has double standards. Is the US, for example, that invaded Afghanistan, Iraq, and where war crimes that have been committed by US military, that have been documented but never prosecuted, are they best qualified to defend international law? That is one of the accusations. And in retrospect, Russia and China, but also other countries, criticized the action of Western states with regard to Libya and the use of the UN Security Council resolution that authorized it. A third example, the atrocities and suffering in wars on the African continent receive only a fraction of the attention that is now being given to Ukraine. On the contrary, the extensive financial aid to Ukraine will come at the expense of development aid given finite budgets. On the other hand, the war in Ukraine, which I fully condemn, will also have devastating consequences for poor people in low-income and developing countries. Russia and Ukraine supplied about 30% of the world's wheat and barley before the war. Many countries, including some of the world's most vulnerable and impoverished, for example, Afghanistan, relied on them for more than half of their wheat imports. This latest food insecurity crisis spreading around the world is not happening in a vacuum. It started with the COVID pandemic, where supply chain issues and soaring inflation, global food prices have started to rise, and we are now at an all-time high. We only know about inflation in Germany. I think today it's 7.8%, but in 36 countries around the world, this inflation for food is more than 15%. And of course, this is devastating and causing major problems for poor families. Acute hunger is also projected to increase by an additional 47 million, from about 280 to 330 million. That is a staggering 17% jump, with the steepest rises in sub-Saharan Africa. Apart from food aid, there are also other types of public services, such as refugee support, healthcare, and the support for multilateral institutions with regard to these public services in fragile states is becoming more and more limited, meaning the means of the international community are becoming more and more limited. In such cases, the turn away from multilateralism is obviously very negative. The UN High Commissioner for Refugees, UNHCR, reports ever larger funding gaps each year. Its programs for refugees from Yemen are only 12% funded, in Afghanistan only 30% funded, meaning there is a huge gap in funding. After all these negative views, and I see your frustrated faces, let's start with the question what to do and how to rebuild trust in the international system. The UN, with its global agenda, and now less dominated by the West, is for sure a viable network and platform to do this. The advantages of multilateral action in a globalized world are very obvious, and I think they're obvious to all states and to all leaders of states. Instead of a normatively overloaded debate, we need to focus on the actual opportunities for shaping the future. For example, diplomacy, even if it fails, is never wrong. Do you know who said that? Angela Merkel, last week, when she gave her first interview in Berlin. I thought it was an interesting sentence, but I liked it, I have to say. Second, finding political solutions for the transformation of conflicts, wars, and humanitarian crises implies a necessity of cooperation, and oftentimes now with regional leadership. And one is... What happened? What did I say? Hopefully it was not me. And of course, you're only able to make peace with your enemy. There's a nice quote by Nelson Mandela. It says, to make peace, you have to shake hands with the devil. Meaning that you only can make peace with the ones who don't agree with you. In the case of Ukraine, maybe it's not a good comparison. It will be the Russian president that we have to make peace with. And we also have to say that 4/5 of all conflicts worldwide are ended by negotiations, by mediation, political mediation, and only 1/5 by the military victory of one side. And we also should focus on issues which we can reach an agreement on. For example, on local ceasefires. That was the case with the OSCE mission in Ukraine. Or when we look at the situation now, we can try to unblock the wheat exports from Ukrainian harbors. instead of always looking at the big picture to end war, which is obviously not feasible. And there is another issue that is, I think it's important, that the normative project of the world that's orientated by the dignity of the human being, by human security, the attempt of placing the strength of the law over the right of the strongest, that should continue to be our aspiration. I have said that I will talk briefly about ZIF. So ZIF is a government organization. It was founded 20 years ago by the German Federal Foreign Office and German Parliament. And it started actually with the background of the wars on the Balkans and the questions, where do you find civilian experts? There was a huge OSCE mission to monitor the ceasefire in Kosovo, and they needed like 100 people to go there. There was a question, where do we find these people? And my joke with the Foreign Office is always that they asked all their English-spoken cousins whether they would be willing to go, and they left in 1 week. But at that time, there was the idea that we always know in international peace operation, we know where the military comes from, we know where the police comes from. In the case of Germany, is a Ministry of the Interior, and it's our Länder. But there was a question, where do you find the civilian experts? So they decided to have one organization, and we have the mandate to focus on conflict prevention and crisis management. We also have teams that work on the analysis, a little think tank that support conceptual development with the United Nations, the European Union, the OSCE, and others. We have a training section that prepares these experts for mission with a lot of internationals participating. We have another team, it's called the National ICD Capacity Development. Oh, I'm happy they're not here. They would kill me for that. But what they do, actually, they organize platforms with international partners, and they focus on issues like the humanitarian cooperation, on mediation and others. And we have a huge team for human resources, as you mentioned at the beginning. As of today, we have 192 civilian experts who work in missions. They're all our colleagues. They have a labor contract with us. There's even a law on that. It's called the Secondment Act. So this is an opportunity for people to internationally support conflict transformation, sustainable peace. And it's a wide variety of people. It's from human rights experts who speak French and work in the Sahel, to Russian-speaking monitors who, again, work in Ukraine or help with humanitarian aid, to political scientists working in Afghanistan, Sudan, and elsewhere. So it might be a perspective for you in the future. Well, at the end, to conclude, let me say the future of multilateralism is rather grim. The international order is moving towards a multipolar order, an order in which there is no common understanding of common values, and where there are different interpretations of the UN Charter. On the other hand, multilateralism will always exist because all states and actors need cooperation. But this will be a heck of a ride in the future. Thank you for your attention. I'm looking forward to many good questions.
Thank you so much for an exciting lecture, and let's open this up right away for questions and comments. The aim really is to turn this a little bit into a conversation, and we can certainly segue from what we've heard to themes that you find pertinent in the context of today's conversation. So the floors are open. If you could also just quickly identify yourselves before asking a question and say where you're from, that would be of great help. So the floor is open. Who's breaking the ice over here? I can certainly do that, but I don't want to. Right, here we go.
Hello, thanks a lot for the talk. My name is Annie. I'm from liberal school, from Armenia originally. My question concerns mainly to Ukraine war. As you have said, the situation is not right yet. or we can say that it has become to the stage of war of partition. So how would you say, how would you assess the involvement of India and China as more of an impartial third parties intervention as a main powerful facilitator, in contrast to the good offices provision by the Turkey? So how Europe and West can negotiate with China and India, taking into consideration their non-alignment, to at least have the ceasefire of the armed conflict. I'm not saying the resolution at first, but at least to engage them in the platform that Russia can be also inclined to get involved.
Well, it's a very important question, because the question is who are good mediators and why. So the first principle is that the negotiators or mediators have to be accepted by the conflict parties. And the main conflict parties are Russia, the Russian Federation as the aggressor, and Ukraine. So the prerequisite for having negotiations is that both sides accept these states or entities. When it comes to China and India, they are not considered impartial by Ukraine at all. I mentioned that earlier, but Ukraine does not want to have them as mediators. They believe they are on the Russian side, therefore that will not be a good option. However, it's still a very important question. Europe, for sure, is also not a good mediator, because we also, for sure, on the Ukrainian side, the US is also out of play. Even the Scandinavian countries are out of play. Even Switzerland, which is traditionally a strong mediator, is not in the game. There are other countries like Turkey. There is Israel, interestingly enough. So there are debates about who could support, and there's many NGOs, there's many governments that try to support this negotiation process. There are a lot of kind of secret talks behind the scenes, but all what I know is that both sides say the moment is not there. None of the sides really want to negotiate. They all hope that there will be more military gains. And of course, if you want to sit at a table, the more weight you bring to the table, the more powerful you are and the less compromises you have to make. So I don't see that at the moment, but the two countries you mentioned, I don't see them as mediators because they will not be accepted. So the question really is, which countries, a question to all of you, could be good countries, or is it at the end of the day the United Nations and the United Nations mediator? Whether you have seen how the United Nations Secretary General has been treated in Russia, so I don't really see that as an option either. So I mean, it's a broad debate. The only options I know which are on the table right now are Turkey and Israel.
We have a couple of questions here, and I'd be tempted to ask one as well. Maybe the gentleman in the back.
Thank you for a nice presentation. I also have a question about the definition of multilateralism, because I didn't get the whole definition. And I also asked myself, maybe it sounds a little bit too easy or too naive, where's the difference between multilateralism and a multipolar order? And I think you mentioned that there can be always multilateralism in any kind of world. So there is no need for a multipolar world to have multilateralism.
And if you could also quickly identify yourself, that would be great.
I'm Philip from the University of Erfurt. I study social science and science of law.
Right, thank you. You want to take that one, or you want to collect it a little bit?
Yeah, well, to make it more clear, thank you for the question. For sure, it's not a contradiction. Multilateralism and a multipolar world, it's not a contradiction. But the vision that Willy Brandt had, and that the West had for at least 30 years, these I call golden years or golden multilateral years, That is not the viable options, that all of us, the whole world, would kind of cooperate and we all agree on what the UN Charter really says. And the development really is that there are different interpretations. I just talked about Russia and China. And of course, from my perspective as a German, I condemn the war in Russia, and I don't see that NATO started the aggression. But Russia also says that based on the UN Charter, there was an aggression. So the question is that if the basic idea of multilateralism of all is that we agree on common values, that is not functioning. Therefore, there will be different groups all over the world, multipolar groups, which rather share their own interpretation of what this multilateralism entails. And therefore, it's for sure not a contradiction. And sorry for not making that clear, so it's a good question.
Thank you. Right.
I'm Kamal from the Willy-Karami second student. I have two simple questions. The first one is, you said that in the global south, the countries and even people think that this multilateralism that we have is more Western-driven interests. And so it's rather representing the interests of the West rather than the global South. For example, China and Russia, there are many other countries that have criticized this. And what's your personal perspective on that? And secondly, you talked about multilateralism, but can you have multilateralism, whereas there are 5 countries within the UN that they have the right to use veto? And each time when there will be a kind of consensus on an issue, so if the interests of these 5 countries are not addressed, then one can stop it. And, we have seen, with the first question, when Iraq was invaded, the Western countries they didn't oppose, although they were not with, but they didn't oppose. But when Ukraine is invaded, so the entire almost Western countries are against. And I think that the reason behind the invasion is the same. US invaded Iraq on a myth, and Russia also accusing Ukraine on baseless, a myth that Ukraine is a threat on Russia.
I would say it's not a simple question, it's rather a statement. And it's actually kind of a summary of what I'm saying. In the West, we have a definition of multilateralism. The things I said, that it's based on common values, and it could be together with other states or other actors, but of course it's the way we interpret these values. But in Russia and China, they strongly support multilateralism in the United Nations or at home. You should listen to UN Security Council debates. You will be amazed. You would think that the Brits and the French and the US that would always use this term, but no, it's the Russians and the Chinese who use that. But of course they have their own definition of what that is. And that makes it so difficult that we kind of end up in different groups. There's a Chinese and Russian group, maybe joined by other BRICS states, who have their interpretation of multilateralism, what it implies, and you have a European Western group, and you have others, especially from the African continent, with the non-aligned states, that have a third version. There might be even a fourth or a fifth. And they all have a different understanding what multilateralism really is. And they all claim the right that what they do is based on the UN Charter. That makes it so difficult. As to the United Nations Security Council, well, it's kind of symbolizes the world order after the Second World War. That's why we have these 5 member states of Russia, the United States, France, Britain, and China. And of course it would need a reform. Everybody wants to reform it, apart from these 5. And interestingly enough, they agree in one thing, not to reform their veto rights. But as long as they have the veto rights, what to do? Therefore, for example, with condemning the war in Ukraine, they used the General Assembly. And there are a couple of ideas what to do. There, like Germany, for example, gave together with Japan and others, gave ideas how to reform the Security Council. But of course, it never finds a majority. And there was another interesting reform approach from Liechtenstein. And Liechtenstein said whenever they oppose or they veto, one country vetoes a Security Council resolution, this country has to go to the General Assembly and explain that. There's an interesting idea. I don't know whether it's going to take place, but I think we all agree this Security Council, this veto rights is really difficult. But unfortunately, these 5 agree exactly on one issue, which is their veto rights.
And the French were even asked to make it a European seat,
but if you have a European seat, then you need an African seat, an Asian seat, so it makes it really difficult.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because other regions than the European seat idea, I personally don't like that.
Oh.
Because then you would say we have 5 or 6 continents, however you count them, and then they all should have a seat. But then if you see the world population, the proportions, it doesn't make sense at all.
Yeah, I find that difficult as well. Yeah, and the hypocrisy is well taken. But I think we have with Lena and a gentleman in the back. I'm not sure who was first. Ladies first, maybe? Please. That's okay.
Thank you. Lena Kiesewetter of the Brandt School. I would like to go back to Anni's question before, who could mediate, in fact. And I'd be interested in what you think about the African Union's role, because if you think about who's affected most on the human security scale outside of the conflict itself, it's many African countries. So they are affected, but not as a conflict party. So do you think that they could possibly, because they're affected, have an interest to negotiate, and would they be accepted?
It's a very good suggestion. However, about 10 years ago, we were all very optimistic about the African Union. A lot of hope was put on this regional organization, and they even have, advised by ZIF and others, they have a continent-wide expert pool for civilian experts. We thought, wow, that's really progressive. However, in the recent years, they really tend to disagree on every single issue. So even with many conflicts on the African continent, you don't find agreement. For example, with all the conflicts in the Sahel, you would say, the African Union, they should send a mediator to go there and help with a group of experts. However, that's not happening. It's only the sub-regional organization, ECOWAS, in Western Africa, that plays quite a crucial role and puts a lot of pressure on these new regimes that kind of reject, or with military coups, and that reject elections and other democratic institutions. But unfortunately, the African Union is it's like the UN Security Council, but on the African continent, they tend to disagree on many, many issues. That's really unfortunate. Otherwise, it would be a good idea.
I ask the gentleman in the back, and then I'm down for a question on my own, if I can. Just completely abuse my
Getting scared.
Yeah.
Thank you. So this is Hussein Mohammed from Department of Religious Studies. So I'm sorry I missed that segment of in your talk, which was about Afghanistan. So please bear with me if I'm asking a question which I already has been answered. But I really wanted to know that how far these approaches of unilateralism, bilateralism, or multilateralism, they work vis-a-vis Afghanistan under Taliban. Given that the country has been literally forgotten, and particularly, I also wanted to know that after this conflict in Ukraine, how much has this affected the attention towards the situation in Afghanistan? And lastly, there is a global debate in the world that whether to engage the Afghanistan and the Taliban at this moment there need to be like certain conditionalities which the Taliban have to fulfill and then to engage. So,
Well, you're rather making a frustrating comment on the situation in Afghanistan. As to the attention, I would say one is, of course, media attention. And the media attention here is all on Ukraine. But the media attention on the African continent is really rather focusing on problems on the African continent, on the food insecurity, on conflicts in, say, in the DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo, or CAR, or the Sahel, and so on. So, of course, that is the perspective from Erfurt, or from Germany, or from Europe. But international diplomacy, like, for example, Germany has a full team working on Afghanistan. They're not represented in the country, but they have a full team working on that. The UN is present there with UNAMA, the United Nations assistance mission to Afghanistan. All the regional countries are, of course, focused on the situation. So it definitely has taken attention from the international scene when it comes to international conferences like the Munich Security Conference, for example. The debate on Afghanistan ended up in a very small room with 10 people this year. 10, you know. In former times, on Afghanistan, you would have a full room with 200 people. So, of course, this symbolizes a little bit the attention. But the problem is that the Taliban, the de facto regime, is not recognized by any country in the world. At the same time, to deliver humanitarian aid, you need the cooperation and also the consent of the host government. In that case, the de facto government that we don't recognize. That makes it really difficult. But of course, at the end of the day, humanitarian aid should be neutral, impartial, and people should be helped. They should not starve to death. So the United Nations organizations working in the country, they definitely work with the Taliban. And you would be surprised. There is more security than before last August in the country. And the Taliban are really helping the humanitarian efforts. And I'm for sure not the spokesperson of the Taliban. But of course, when you look from here, you see all is negative, but they're much more cooperative than the former government on humanitarian aid. They send, I mean, there's a lot of security for the people working there as compared to last year or the first part of last year. So that's really interesting. But of course, I totally agree, there should be always this conditionality, and the international community, whoever that is, then should not accept that girls are not allowed to go to school. They should not accept that women are not allowed to work. They should not accept that women have to cover themselves. It's not even an Islamic rule. I mean, I'm Orientalist, so it gets me started with my Sharia knowledge, but of course it's not Islamic. It's their very extreme interpretation of the Holy Quran, or the Sharia for that matter.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, sorry. Yes, my name is Jafar, the Brandt student. So my question is that, so are you accepting that finally the EU is like somehow supported Taliban to be back to the power, because US allowed Taliban to open a diplomatic office to Doha, and also forced the Afghanistan government to release 5,000 Taliban members from the jail. So it's my first part question. And second, so it was not just about just the US, if you consider the event of Ukraine and Afghanistan, we can see that it's a kind of double standard. You know, for the case of Afghanistan, we can see that just all of the Western countries just let Taliban kept power while they were there. But in case of Ukraine, you can see that all countries are somehow involved and they are actively supporting the Ukrainian government. But it was somehow not.
Well, for the first part, as I said, this Doha deal from February 2020, There's a deal between the US. It was basically a deal by Salman Khalilzad, who you obviously know, and the Taliban delegation in Doha. And of course, they offered the Afghan government to the Taliban on a silver plate. I think they wouldn't even disagree, because there was no conditions. There was only conditions like saying there should never be terrorism from the Afghan soil. How do you measure that? I mean, what is terrorism, first of all, and how could possibly a government control that? So I definitely say that it was, I'm really unhappy is not the right word. It's really not a good, it's a really bad deal, and it's for sure not a peace agreement. It's for sure not a peace agreement. And of course, it comes with all that they had to release 5,000 Taliban from jail and many other things they put, or they kind of told the former Afghan government to do. With regard to your second question, I do not agree, because that's exactly what I'm saying. You hear from Erfurt, or from a German perspective and following German news, you see that we all support Ukraine, and you see the other European countries, and you see the US. But of course, go to the BRICS states, to many non-aligned states, and there's not much support or sympathy for Ukraine and for the Ukrainian government or for Zelensky. It's rather the opposite. I mean, talk to some people in Afghanistan. They're really unhappy with Zelensky because they said that it has a bad effect on us, as I talked about the food insecurity. And of course, he also plays a role there. He's a puppet of the West. So that's my main point, saying, you see, depending on the perspective, there are different visions of the same political events that take place. So from our perspective here, and including myself, I do support Ukraine. I think that it was an aggressive war, and they are victims to that, and I think the Russian Federation has no right. But of course, there are different interpretations than others, like the Russians, like many BRICS states, apart from Brazil, as I said earlier, who don't support that version. So not all support Ukraine. That's wrong. It's only a perspective from here.
We have a gentleman in the back again, but he wants to ask the second question, so I need to take people who want to ask the first. So maybe.
But I'm still waiting for your question.
Yeah, I know. But you know, the moment they're in, I think they take the first seat here.
Hello, I'm from Multilateral. My question is, can world peace be multilaterally achieved by breaking the non-proliferation of nuclear weapons right now? Because Ukraine decided to not develop or invest in nuclear weapons, and here's where like a little philosophical statement that sometimes the threat of danger can be helpful for world peace.
Was the Budapest Agreement a good idea? So
yeah, by breaking the non-proliferation.
Yeah, we're getting into the easy questions now. So.
Yeah, well, the Budapest Agreement, from the Ukrainian perspective, was definitely a terrible idea, and it is advice to many other countries. Don't believe in these agreements where others tell you that they will protect you. I guess that's a lesson from that. As to the nuclear threats, you might have listened or followed the publication of the CIPRI yearbook yesterday, which says that the number of nuclear arms have dropped a little bit, also in the US and in Russia, but it's only because some of these nuclear weapons are old. You see, but it's not. I mean, it's rising again, and that's the trend they describe. So, I mean, I love this vision of world peace, but unfortunately, working in this business for many years, and I'm not cynical about it. I don't believe in it, and I just have to observe the same trend as you're describing. There's even more nuclear proliferation. It's on the rise again.
Now I need to ask my quick question.
No.
This is very just, if we turn from the multilateral perspective down to really, what happens on the ground when it comes to the operations of your organization. I'm just wondering whether we can make this a little bit more tangible for us. We have two very different situations. One, in Ukraine, we have an open war. Two governments, they exist, they make statements, they do what governments need to do, but them being at war, conflict zones, atrocities, all the rest of it. Afghanistan, very different, right? You don't have a government. I mean, there is a ruling group. No one's recognized them. If we're talking multilateralism, they don't appear in that term really. And yet you're active. And I'm just wondering, what this means on the ground. What does this mean in terms of day-to-day operations? Where are the limits in terms of what people can do? What is the normative dilemmas in which people need to take decisions, when working, for instance, with the Taliban, or in environments they normatively cannot support. And I'm just wondering whether you can make this a little bit more tangible for us, because as an organization, I think CIF is really unique. And we do have a bunch of students in this room who do conflict studies and conflict management, so I'm wondering whether you could share some thoughts on that.
Yeah. It's also not an easy question because, you all know these conflict cycles, no? Mm-hmm. And then usually when you start about the instruments to tackle these conflicts, depending on where you are, you're trying to do prevention in order to prevent military action, war, or open conflict. And then you have this, when there is war, you have this transitional phase where you try to bring about a peace agreement, the negotiations, the mediation. And once there is an agreement, then you have to find the implementation phase of this agreement. And then, of course, after it has been implemented, there is again prevention, because most of the conflicts break out again, unfortunately, after the average 15 years. So there is this conflict cycle. And then you have, of course, different international actors. And depending on where we are, you need a different set of actors. If there's open war conflict, as civilian experts, we get not involved. It's military. It's only the military, if you have international troops, who are mandated to bring about security, protection of civilians, then this is their mandate. When it comes to the phase of trying to negotiate a peace agreement, we have many people who have a background in mediation, in negotiations, political scientists and others who have studied that, conflict studies. And then, of course, most of the time our experts are following this phase when it's about to implement a peace agreement, when to build sustainable institutions, when to build a sustainable government. We want to make sure it takes care of their duties as a government, to provide food, security, education, access to health, and so on. So we have many people working in this phase, and that is the phase in a conflict situation where we send the most experts. So how it works really is that we wait for a call by the United Nations. That's actually the biggest provider of peace operations, with, about 20 or 30 right now political missions and peacekeeping missions, or we wait by a call by Brussels, by the Common Security and Defense Policy, or we wait by a call by the OSCE in Vienna, or NATO in Brussels, or the Organization of American States, or other international organizations, and they ask in a call for civilian experts. And then this is an international call, and it's given to all governments. Let's take an example. Right now, for the EU assistance mission in Ukraine, we're looking for experts to document the atrocities in the war. So Brussels sends out this call. This call goes to the German Federal Foreign Office, and it is shared with us. We have an expert pool. In this expert pool, we have the profiles about 1,200, roughly. And mainly these people in this expert pool who qualify to become a civilian expert Usually, to qualify, you need at least 5 years of work experience. You need, of course, intercultural skills, good language skills, and whatever professional background. So this call for the EU AM in Ukraine is shared with this pool, and we look, for example, with people with judicial background, we look for people who speak Russian or Ukrainian, and then they see the job description and then they apply. When we see that their application matches the job description, we nominate them, and it goes back to Brussels, and Brussels then decides who gets the job. And roughly that happens with all 192, to make it more tangible for you, hopefully. And it's really in the phase of implementing a peace agreement or even before. And I would say we always talk about prevention, but very few really are sent to a place where we are scared that a conflict will break out. Because there is no peace operation. I mean, that is the international political community that only reacts when there is open conflict. That's unfortunately, that's also the prevention dilemma, so to say. So that is how it works basically, and I can say that this organization is one of the few worldwide who are really professional about it. Because us as having labor contracts, we also of course have to take care of we have to do the duty of care of these people. And of course, I mean, when I sign a labor contract with somebody who goes to Ukraine right now, there's a lot of steps that have happened before. There's the security management team or human resources teams. We make sure that they have a good security training. We make sure they have the right qualification. We make sure that they're really apt to work in this kind of situation. And of course, one is the international duty of mandate, to document the atrocities, and one is the duty of care for the person who goes there. Mm-hmm. So that is kind of roughly how it works. And that's what we do for, we even got more money from the current government, so we'll go to increase the number. It's a good instrument actually of multilateral or international cooperation.
That's what I was asking, yeah, thank you.
But it's a new profile for people.
Oh.
It's really a new career path.
Thank you for sharing. Any other questions? I think you've been waiting for a while, so you ask a question if you will. Let's take a last round. Is there anyone else who would quickly like to weigh in? Last chance. Okay, you got the last one.
And this is one comment of the colleague. I want to come back to this law deal. So I asked myself, is this an example where multilateralism has its limits, because the Trump administration deals only with the Taliban, and Trump was famously in favor of this bilateral deals, and the Chinese sometimes tends to favor this deals too. So do you think these bilateral deals will happen more often in the future?
Hopefully not.
I have a crystal ball for you if you want.
I would say hopefully not. It was definitely one of the worst examples I can think of multilateral cooperation, because it was no multilateral cooperation. It had no UN support, it had no NATO support, it had no support of the neighborhood, especially not of the Afghan government. Whether it will happen more often is a different question, but of course it had, and that often happens in conflicts and wars. It happened for domestic reasons in the US and also in other NATO partners countries. Also in Germany, there was a huge fatigue of our military intervention in Afghanistan. There was a huge fatigue. It was really difficult to explain to people why that still was important and why after 20 years there was no more success stories we could share. So it had domestic reasons why Trump wanted that agreement, but also by the democratic government, by President Biden. He kind of implemented it in a very bad way, I have to say. But I would say really it was a US-Taliban agreement. Why this will happen more often, I don't know. But for example, in the case of Ukraine, I don't see who could do that. Of course, Russia wants to deal with the US as well. Of course, Russia wants to sit at the table with the US and the Russian president. But I don't think that would happen that way again. I don't think that the Ukrainians would accept that, and I think there would be many others to intervene. But of course, I don't know. But hopefully, this will not happen more often, more bilaterally, because it's also not a sustainable agreement at all. I don't know what's going to happen in Afghanistan, but for sure, I don't think that there will be a de facto Taliban regime in 5 years' time. I don't see that at all, because they don't deliver. I mean, they.
Oh, that's not good news, because it might mean civil war.
It might be another war, but of course, it's also bad news that the government doesn't deliver. I mean, it happens in many fragile states, but that's terrible news.
We have a latecomer, and you have the last one, so please, by all means, have a question.
So, Mario Gabriel, Willy Brandt, first-year student. My question is, are we talking lessons learned with respect to that bilateral deal between the U.S. and the Taliban already, or is it too soon for that?
Well, that's a very good question. In Germany, our new coalition government agreed on establishing an enquête commission. It's a commission that will be led by a member of parliament, Michael Müller, former friend of Dietmar Herz. And there will be half of the people will be members of parliament and half of the people will be experts. I mean, whatever an expert is, but people like me who get this label, but people who should draw lessons from that. And what we do at ZIF, and I think that's really of crucial importance, we try to do the lessons learned. One is, of course, what happened there, but of course it's more important for international cooperation. What it means, I mean, it actually is the same question. And of course, the lesson learned is that it's not a feasible agreement. But the question also is the lessons learned are not only the Doha deal, but what happened the 20 years before, why it was so much money and with so many international troops sent there, with so many civilians engaged. I mean, there was a time there was more than 150,000 troops and the Taliban resisted. The question is why that happened. So there is an enquête commission here. There's lessons learned processes in the US. You might have heard about the CIGAR. This is this special investigator of the government of America for Afghanistan, something like that, who publishes really interesting report, very critical of the US government. But it happens in many other governments and think tanks as well. But the question really is whether it might be too early. And I personally have to say I'm a little bit hesitant as well, because for people who have been involved, like myself, it's difficult to evaluate what we have done. And I think there's an ethics in evaluation. If you, for example, had to evaluate how the chair of the Willy Brandt school is functioning,
I'd do a great job.
You see? There you go. So that makes it a little bit difficult. So I think it might take a little bit more time to have a better picture of what really happened. And the question is how many people really want to learn these lessons. I'm not sure.
In the very beginning, you talked about 30 years of multilateralism, and you called them the golden years. And I guess what we've learned after this lecture and the discussion is that they're certainly over. We don't know exactly what's to come. I think the one thing we can say for this country is first Afghanistan, then Ukraine. That was probably the crudest awakening they could probably get after having happily sat through the 30 years before. We're even talking about Zeitenwende, whatever that means. We're not sure yet. Also, that's a little bit too early. But I guess what it means is we have to continue that conversation at some point going forward, and again take stock of what it means to talk about a multipolar world, whether any order is involved in that, and whether multilateralism is something that we can sustain. So thanks very much for joining us today. Dr. Wieland-Karimi, and for giving the lecture. Don't leave without a thing that's important.
My cup.
The cup you have.
Oh.
It's a lot more important, actually.
Okay.
It's a lot better. It's honey.
Oh,
We
great.
grow honey on this campus. It's in here
Thank you.
with a few other things.
Thank you
And
so much.
I can proudly say when I was made a chair at this university, it was our president who proudly handed over my piece of honey. So you only get that once in your life.
Okay. Thank you.
Unless you come back. So thank you so much for joining us. Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah.